Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Dotson. I'm the founder and program coordinator for Highland Park Poetry, and I'm really excited to be your host today for Poetry Today. And I have two guests, Chicago's poetry power couple, Jenene Ravensloot and Tom Roby IV. As brief introduction, Jenene Ravensloot is a member of the Poets Club of Chicago, the Illinois State Poetry Society, Poets and Patrons, the Tallgrass Writers Guild, and the Arizona State Poetry Society. She has written 4 books of poetry: Loot, Stolen Memories, and Tales Out of School, The Chronicles of Scarbo, The Chronicles of Scarbo 2nd edition, and Floating Worlds. She has got a new book which is expected to be published by the end of this year. Jenene has also led many poetry workshops at various Chicago public libraries, universities, poetries and patrons, and other venues. She has judged several poetry contests. She has been published in a multitude of journals such as Caravel Literary Arts Journal, the Daily Haiku, Packingtown Review, The Miscreant, After Hours Press, Exact Change Only, This Literary Magazine, Seeding the Snow, Poetry Fish, and a host of others. I did reduce the number because it would just go on forever.
Be the whole show.
Sorry. That would be it. That would be the 30 minutes right there. Okay. And Tom Roby IV, he publishes and performs his poetry in Chicago while writing criticism and winning various competitions. He's president and critique leader of the Poets Club of Chicago. Is also the past chair of their annual Helen Shable Sonnet Contest. He's a member of the Illinois State Poetry Society and Poetry and Patrons. His poems have appeared in After Hours Press, Exact Change Only, Poetry Fish, Frog Pond, and other journals. He has also been, well, actually both of you have been on our, when we did the Poetry That Moves contest, you both had your poems featured on North Shore buses operating between Evanston and Waukegan in Highland Park.
Another great idea of yours.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. Sadly, we don't do that anymore, but we'll try to have other new opportunities for poets. Tom has also published a chapbook called Griever's Circuit by Fractal Press in 2004. 2 other poetry books, Shapeshifter from Pudd'nhead Press and Pressure Points from Bendinger Press. With the Poets Club of Chicago, he has developed the Poetry Wheel, in which each poet reads explicitly in relation to the previous poem. So it's by theme or word or image or form, I suppose. There's got to be some strong connection that bridges poem to poem to poem, and the whole result is a kind of a wheel. Okay, right, gotcha. The wheel's been performed at various poetry venues and fests, including Chicago Public Libraries. And both of you are really doing cutting-edge stuff with a lot of cinepoetry. You both have lots of poems of yours that you've created, films, little mini films that are on YouTube.
They're in collaboration with other artists, some as far as in Australia even.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
In fact, I just recently had one of mine in Spain.
So they contacted you and said,
I
we
have
love your poem.
relationships. I have relationships online with people I've never officially met.
Okay.
And we collaborate. For instance, I'll give them a poem, and then there'll be a filmmaker, and there'll be someone perhaps who will want to read my poem or not.
Okay.
Maybe I'll read it. Another person might do the soundscape, and we'll all come together. But we won't actually talk about the process. We'll just each relinquish, and then at the end we have our product and we send it out.
Video poems are very big in Europe,
and
they have festivals in Ireland.
Yeah.
One of hers is in a festival in Ireland right now.
Oh, okay.
And so that's ongoing.
What is a Cinepoem festival like? I mean, is this
Well,
like
I've
screening?
never-
You've never been?
I've never been to one because most of them happen to be in Europe, and but they just show a huge. Sometimes there's winners, first, second, third.
Okay.
Sometimes they simply have a huge festival where you see a large amount of films.
And then they have a setup with a big screen and an audience, and they go through.
And it's extremely popular in Europe. I'm amazed.
Wow. Well, we did do Highland Park Poetry did have this
we were
Fest,
there.
and we were trying to. We need to keep doing that, I think, because I think we need to push the tide so that the cine poetry becomes a thing in here. And I guess part of it is access.
Yes.
Where do you work with the video people or do you?
Well,
how did you find someone to film?
How it sort of
poem?
happened? There was the poets. Now I'm blanking. The poetry warehouse, storehouse.
Okay.
The poetry storehouse. Excuse me. And that's sort of how I got involved. And what you would do is you would send them, let's say, 5 poems. If they liked those 5 poems, they would put it in the storehouse, and then people who were into cinematography could go in and take your words and your audio and then create the video poem. And so that was very big for about 1.5 years, and unfortunately it is no longer in existence. And it was online, so through Facebook.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how I met various people and got involved in it.
Well, maybe that's something we ought to do with looking to the future. Using the social media platform of Facebook to connect with the cinema.
Sure.
Because that was, I think, the real holdup for the success of our program that we did with Highland Park Poetry, was that we just, we had poets that were very interested in having their work.
But you didn't have cinematographers.
But we didn't have cinematographers.
Yeah.
And so we were encouraged. So the people who were most successful in participating most of them were ones who had kids who were, or teenagers who knew how to operate the equipment and could even transform, like video on the phone and edit it on a MacBook or something like that to create.
It is difficult, and it's very, very time consuming.
Yeah.
I mean, it takes hours and hours just to do 1 minute of film.
Sure.
So that becomes a real problem. And of course, there's not that much money in it at all.
I didn't know there was any money in it.
Well, actually, I don't think there is. There surely must be some people that are making money from it.
Well, maybe in Europe.
Maybe in Europe,
Right.
but
Sure.
I don't think anyone that's doing it here, really.
Well, we've seemed to become completely taken over by the topic of cinema poetry, and you guys have lots of poems. That's wonderful. Sure. But the other interesting thing in your bio, which I didn't even get a chance to mention, is the fact that you're both form a trio called Omniphonic, a trio with Roby as your son.
Yes.
And that performs the poems with the sounds of the poems. And you've hosted the annual Omniphonic Challenge for poetry bands and have produced a CD.
Yes,
this is
that one there.
This is the CD. I don't know if you can
Omniphonic.
get it, but it's a pretty cool cover.
It's a great cover, yeah.
And very neat. So, and this is synthesizer.
This is a guitar synthesizer. He makes every sound in the universe. And I did a poem about my grandfather, and he was a ship inspector, and he had a little hammer that he went, climbed up and hit the hull of the ship. And he went and found not the actual sound or an imitation, but a sound, a compelling sound that brought the reader into the poem. And it was just, it's a kind of a magic if you can find those kinds of sounds, or in the video poem, those visuals that express the poem.
Well, it seems that both of you are very excited about collaborating with other types of artists to sort of get poetry out into the world beyond the page.
Yeah.
And that's enormously exciting.
Well, it started with ourselves because we found we had all these common interests, but different angles. Jenene has an extensive background in art, and we had these resources like LEM to work with, and so it's been quite a ride.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Couple of questions that I had for you. I wanted to talk specifically about this book, The Chronicles of Scarbo. I think it's really fascinating, and I have a copy, which thank you very much. And that is that it's a concept book. So it's a collection of poems connected to the character of Scarbo. And you want to talk a little bit about Scarbo?
Well, it's rather complex, but Scarbo is a character from a piece of work called Gaspard de la Louis, Treasures of the Night, and he's a character in that, and from the 1800s, basically.
Around 1830. Bertrand was the inventor of the prose poem,
and that's the important
very
thing.
influential French.
He's the inventor of prose poetry, and he had several different characters, but one of the most interesting was Scarbo. But his was sort of this little imp creature, dwarf imp, and I wanted to take the character of Scarbo and bring him forward into the 21st century and make him more of a rounded human being, but one who was interested in art and the arts and aesthetics and so forth and so on. And I thought, but kind of riffing slightly on that original book.
Okay.
So almost everything in this particular book is prose poetry. And Bertrand, who was the author of the original book that I riffed off of, was an amazing guy, very, very smart, and he never saw his book actually realized. He died before his book was ever published. And people like Baudelaire and Rimbaud and all those people were very much influenced by his work. And so I thought it would be interesting to bring it forward again.
Okay.
You know, so that's, and I worked with a friend of mine and she did the illustrations. Her name's Stephanie Miller, and did some amazing black and white illustrations. And in the original book, Bertrand also did his own drawings.
Okay.
So
Right.
I wanted to kind of incorporate that idea.
Keep the visual art.
And keep the visual. And Ravel did three
pieces.
Three pieces
Gaspard
on
de la
Gaspard
Nuit
de la
and,
Nuit. And so this gentleman, Bertrand, and this story has been coming forward and coming forward and coming forward. So that's kind of what this is about.
Well, I guess the thing is, most times when I'm interviewing poets, it's like, oh, well, I created a collection of some of my best work, and sometimes there's a thematic thing with the later collections, but it oftentimes is really just, this is my best stuff. Here it is. And so to have a complete concept for a collection is kind of interesting.
Well, it is, and I even have Scarbo writing poetry, and so there's a body of poems in here that supposedly he wrote. But
so it's like meta poetry. It's like poetry within.
It's poetry within the poetry.
Gotcha.
And there's a lot of talk, a lot of mention of music of different kinds, also incorporating the Ravel concept, and so it's sort of like almost in a way interactive, if you will, without really being interactive. I mean, you have music, you have drawing, you have actual poems, you have prose poetry, all in there. Yeah.
Well, I feel like we are depriving the audience of
And we have
a chance to hear you guys read. Tom, do you have a poem that you could read for us?
Oh, sure. And one of the things I think is interesting about Jenene's work is that it's really quite an extensive exploration of the noir world, of which Bertrand was one of the creators, coming out of people like E.T.A. Hoffmann and that whole interest in the French literary scene, and and Jenene has developed this through her 4 books. My story is a little more. I started when I really began writing. I had a kind of a background of images and stories, and they seemed to fall into various genres, like family poems, travel poems, ekphrastic poems. I'm a big fan of those, and so And I also, the Griever's Circuit had was poems that I wrote after the death of my late wife, and this I'll just read you a short one from here, which is the Evensong. I love that time of night before night comes, when the last lit skies rest blue in the elms, whose limbs are as black as the night that comes, and their silent leaves are but a thought of green. When you are near, I love that time. Evensong.
Now that was a poem. That was a poster on the bus.
Yes.
Oh,
Right.
oh, that's
Yes.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was
Thank you.
also made into a video poem along with
neat.
another.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So,
See, that's great. That's a wonderful poem that's been
thank you.
in different incarnations, I guess. The poem itself has been the
Exactly.
same, but it's been expressed.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and then you
forms.
find different aspects of the poem when you subject it to these different artistic tropes and the rest. It's on the omniphonic.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, great.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I think that's the really interesting thing is on the page it's one thing. When you hear it as an audio, it's another thing. When you see it visually and as audio, that's another thing. When you hear it on a CD, that's another thing. So there's all these different layers. So it's not what we like. It's not one and done. You have many different
Right.
ways that you can express it.
Or experience for the audience to
Yes.
experience.
Well,
right?
yeah,
yes.
and one of the things that we also worked on in our workshops is using different forms. What happens to the poem if it starts off as a villanelle and then you turn it into a sonnet or turn it into a pantoum, and it shows different aspects of the experience that you missed on in the other version.
I know over the years I've seen your announcements of different workshops that you've done, like the Sistina,
Right.
Yeah.
where you've tried to get contemporary writers to think about these more classical forms
Yeah.
Right.
that may be intimidating or scary or off-putting.
Sure.
Or,
And what
or
we-
not de rigueur.
Yeah. What we try to emphasize is that once you learn the form, there's room for play. You don't have to treat it rigidly. You can play with it once you understand what the form is, and it can really open up all kinds of meaning.
Okay.
And it also gives you a little fence, right? When you're first writing, it's a form poem creates a little fence for you, a little safety area, and then after that you can blow it open and try other things with it.
The interesting thing, I was reading in Poetry and Writers magazine, and this author was talking about writing for comic books, and I forget who he was quoting, but the person said, if you can break dance, likened poetry to break dance. He says, if you can break dance, that's interesting. But if you can break dance in a straitjacket, now that's something to marvel at.
That's really
So,
interesting.
Yes. You talk
Yeah.
about,
Yeah.
the form poetry, like
Right.
the Sistina or the Pantoum
Yeah,
or
right.
Villanelle that you
Right.
mentioned, that's like the straitjacket that you put on
Sure.
to do your break dance.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Very
I'm
nice.
working on a series
Very
now where I've taken one poem and I have about 8 different versions of the same poem,
Oh, wow.
using different forms, and it really does kind of force you to stretch and grow and look at the poem in different ways.
Do you find that you prefer one version over the other? or you're
Sometimes.
all- okay.
I think Sistinas are fabulous when you're feeling very obsessive about something, because it's
Okay.
an obsessive form.
Because you're repeating.
You're
again
repeating
again
and repeating.
again.
So that can be very, when you understand enough forms, you can then say, oh, for this particular poem, this would work as opposed to that. Like if you have a love poem, maybe a sonnet works best, who knows? Or maybe something else.
Speaking of poetry, can you read a poem for us?
Yes, I
Jenene?
can.
That'd be
And
great.
I'm actually going to do a noir from my newest book that'll be out, I hope, within the month and a half. I'm thinking
Okay.
it's titled Sliders, but I'm going to read The Dog Doesn't Bark Anymore.
Okay.
And because, as you know, that's a very common trope. There's the ringing of the telephone. There's the barking of the dog. You know, I mean, there's all these very common tropes that people, and so I actually had this happen. A neighbor of ours, but so I'll read it anyway. The dog doesn't bark anymore. He used to bark. He used to bark and bark and bark. But he doesn't bark anymore. I try not to think about that dog. The dog was a real nuisance. He used to bark and bark when he was alone in that dark apartment. He'd bark and bark until his owner came home and let the dog out the back door. The dog never barked then. He would roll on his back and kick his paws in the air. He acted like a puppy until he jumped up and ran back up the stairs. Later, he would begin to bark and bark. The neighbors complained. We all complained. Someone called the landlord. Someone called the cops. I guess the landlord had a few words with his owner. The dog doesn't bark anymore. He never barks. Never. That's what really bothers us now.
It is noir. Okay. What happened?
And after I read that, everybody goes, "Oh, the poor dog."
But you do. I love the repetition of the bark.
And that's what I was
And
trying to do.
Yeah,
And
sure,
after a
you
while,
get
it
that.
really irritates me
Sure,
even to
yeah.
read it. You know? But that's the whole idea, to incorporate that into the poem. And yet, and like a friend of mine said, you already know the dog doesn't bark anymore, and yet to the very end, you're hanging on.
Right.
Wanting to know what happened, you know?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I was going to ask you also, since you've published such a variety of books, you've worked with different publishers.
Yes.
And how do those relationships occur? Do you have and what's that experience been like? Or any favorite publishers or favorite
You wanna start
experiences?
Well, I have a kind of a varied experience. Grievous Circuit was produced by Fractal Edge Press. That's Wayne Allen Jones, who is somebody who's on the scene in a number of different roles. He's a poet himself, and that was my chapbook. The second book. This was in about 2005. This one, Shapeshifter. There we go. And this was done by David Getchik, who of Pudd'nhead Press, who kept pestering me to put out a book, and he did this for me. And then the other one is Pressure Points, which is a kind of a hybrid. It has a lot of form poems, but the form poems are also not imaged in their usual sense. That I put them in boxes. And so that, for instance, the end rhymes of the triolet would not come at the end of a line, but would be buried. They'd come inside and then jammed. And this Jenene was the editor of this book, and she was a big help as we tried to see how we could push the forms into different ways of expression and make them more interesting for the reader.
Neat. Well, we are actually getting close to the end of our program, but I did want to talk about since I've never interviewed a poetry couple before. you're certainly like unusual, I think, in the
Yes.
poetry scene. So
Yes.
can you talk about that, the pros and cons?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. I think it's like whether you're in acting or music or dance, I think there's many pros to being a couple that share the same passion. It can be very exciting. You can share things, knowledge. For instance, when I have come to poetry very late, I started out as an artist, and so having, Tom in a way was able to expose me to things that perhaps I wouldn't have been exposed to, and vice versa. I came into poetry very much interested in foreign poetry. Tom not as much, so we've been able to trade information, and I've been able to introduce him to poets that he wasn't familiar with, dead poets, and vice versa. And so, and the beautiful part about being a partner is I have someone, if I'm working on a poem, I can read what I'm working on and get some feedback, and vice versa, where if you have a partner who isn't a poet and or a painter or a dancer, it can oftentimes be very difficult to really talk about what you're working on.
Right. So you're sort of like a good sounding board before it gets any public
Well,
exposure.
Yes. Yeah. It's
to
not
an
necessarily.
audience
Yeah.
or a journal or anything.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
It gives you, and you're able to talk through things.
Particularly aesthetic issues that have to do with the function of foreign poetry, for instance, and the evolution of the noir world. You can get into the philosophical issues, and I have a background in philosophy, so that's one of my interests has been aesthetics, and there's a sense of support that you have that is important for an artist, because as you get off
there's
in your
a lot of rejection.
There's
and then
a
you
lot
get all
of
alone
rejection.
in your
Right, sure.
study, and
And I mean, you can have a mate that is very supportive of your work and not a writer themselves, but the tendency there to say, "Oh, honey, that's just fabulous.
Yes, right.
That's just fabulous."
Dear.
You know?
I wonder what my husband really thinks.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, it has been a real privilege to have you both
Thank
on the
you.
program today.
Thank
and
you.
I know
It's been a privilege to be here.
you guys are really Chicago poetry embodied to me. So
thank you.
I'm really excited
you.
that you could join us, and we look forward to seeing your new book.
I'm looking forward to it
and,
also.
Thank you so much. Are you also working on a new manuscript, or?
yeah, well, I'm collecting. It being in the Poets Club, and we meet once a month, so you basically are going to have 12 poems in a year,
Okay.
and so
but may I
those-
just mention that the Benningers have been, Bruce and Lorelei Benninger have been very supportive
What's
of my
the
work.
company?
It's Benninger Communications
Okay.
and First Flight Books. They've been very, very supportive of my work, and so I just wanted to mention
Yes,
them.
sure.
Yeah.
No, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Sliders is the title of the...
Sliders, yes,
the-
like as in what you eat, as in a lot of other things. It has a lot of different
sliding
meanings.
by.
Slide by. Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
interesting.
Yeah.
So does that embody the concept of
Yes.
the whole book? Okay.
Well, the concept is basically noir, but the image of sliders in different permutations moves through the book. Whether it's the sliders you eat,
At White Castle.
yeah, White Castle, or
sliders
but we
that
don't
put
mention White
something over
Castle.
on you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's actually different meanings to the word sliders, so I played with that a little bit too.
Well, we look forward to seeing that. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
This is really
Thank
good.
you. It's been a real privilege.
Yeah.